Let me tell you a story about stories. So, I spent my teenage years in a small town in southern Colorado. And at that time, Castle Rock was not what it is today. Today, the town is replete with brew pubs and paved roads, world class malls, and a functioning hospital. When I moved there in the mid 90s, only half the roads were paved. There was no such thing as a nightlife, and the fanciest establishment was a diner that closed at 12 p.m. The town was named for the iconic geological formation of rhyolite capping a nearby hill, like a huge stone castle. Atop this 20-foot tall rock is a flag and a metal star, which the town lights every winter. When I moved to Castle Rock, the town was just beginning to feel the pains of growth from the tech boom in Denver. I remember when we got our first Waffle House. That was the moment the town knew it was destined for great things. Like so many towns in America, there was a huge gap of wealth in the town. In the center of the town was the historic district housing the working class in homes that dated back to the rhyolite mines of the turn of the century. And then surrounding that were the palatial estates that were reminiscent of robber barons of that same period. There was crippling poverty and there was housing insecurity for most of us, but there was not a sizable homeless population. Indeed, in my entire time in Castle Rock, there was only one homeless person. His name was Terry, and the town gave him the cognomen Terry the Bum. The town gave him little else. And perhaps what comes to mind for many of us is the archetypical character Otis from the Andy Griffith Show, a lovable and harmless alcoholic who acts as a foil or a joke to many a plot. Everyone in town had a story about a run-in with Terry. The time that some high school kids thought that they could get Terry to buy them booze, but instead he ran off with their liquor and their change. Or the time that Terry crashed his bicycle into the side of this or that person's car. As skateboarders who traveled the entire town in search for new and odd places to do tricks, my friends and I often ran into Terry. Loading docks, strange medians behind Pizza Hut. We dwelled in the margins of the town, and so did Terry. Everyone also had their own origin stories of Terry. One story went that Terry was actually a secret millionaire and that he was just eccentric and playing a role. Another story went that Terry had been on the construction team who built the iconic star on top of the Castle Rock, or even that he heroically carried the flag to the top of the rock himself, only to be laid off. The town of Castle Rock did not have a shelter, and in the cold winter months, Terry would periodically not be seen. People speculated that maybe he hopped on a train or went south. Others thought that maybe he went to his home. He could be seen many a January riding his bicycle in the middle of Main Street playing chicken with passing motorists. And many believed he did this so that he would be arrested and he could spend time in the warmth of the brand new police station. There were plenty of churches in our town. None of them were UU. Rumor had it that every church had tried and failed to convert Terry. And maybe they tried to provide him with aid, but that was never part of the story. The only time that I ever spoke with Terry, he announced to me that it was hard to live up to a name. I asked him what name was he living up to, and he exclaimed, Terry B-E-S-T, Terry Best. And then he laughed raucously. I think that we all told the stories to make sense of homelessness in an isolated town in the middle of the plains. The stories shielded us from the horrifying realities of our world. Terry had represented a failure of our town to take care of all of its citizens. Terry exposed to us the possibility that many of us faced if we missed one paycheck. Our stories converted the unpleasant realities into ironic legends of eccentricity or heroism. And, it's about 2 decades now, and I still think about Terry. Having spent so many years working in the human services and working with folks in Brooklyn who were housing insecure, I think about Terry and of all the stories around him. Many places which try to help folks out of homelessness follow a model first conceived of in New York City. The model offers not only housing placement, food security, skill development, but it also requires that folks tell their life story. There's a book called Sacred Shelter, and it's gathered many of these stories together from the original program. It's a powerful book. They have the homeless people in the program tell their story, not so that the story can be placed in pamphlets or be used for fundraising events. Folks are asked to tell their story so as to weave together a unity and meaning of their lives. They tell their story so that they can hear their own story. Often in our society, to be homeless is to have no place to legally exist. It's hard to imagine a coherent unity when you are placeless. Telling stories allows us to create a unity and a whole out of our experiences in life. And we don't just tell one story, nor do we tell that one story the same way over time. The story changes, certain facts come forward and certain facts recede into the background. Every story in its heart holds a multiplicity of truths which emerge differently with each telling. And I'm telling you these stories because the absence of a life story, the absence of the ability to tell your story, exposes the value of storytelling. Stories make meaning, and when we aren't encouraged or allowed to make meaning for ourselves, others will invent meaning for us, as we did for Terry. And in thinking about this, I've been dwelling on the fourth principle lately. We often forget about the fourth principle, or at least I do, since I am so drawn to the first and the seventh principles. But the fourth principle, which asserts the need for a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, is deeply part of why we find our spiritual home in UU. I often think of the free and responsible search for truth and meaning as an assertion to be open and tolerant to different stories of meaning and truth, while also being mindful that sometimes these sources can be used to harm other people. And that's true, but I think there's something more there. Telling stories is our primary mode of engaging truth. It's not just having a story, but attending to how we tell it, to whom we tell it, and why we tell it. All of this contributes to the texture of the truth we reveal. All stories say something about the storyteller. All stories reveal some truth, even if these stories contain no facts. So the story of Terry Best being a secret millionaire did not contain any credible facts. But these stories do reveal the truth of the storyteller's ideology. As a nation, we have seen this in stories around the countless murders of Black people at the hands of the police. Who tells their story, to whom, and how that story is told reveals a great deal about the priorities and ideologies of the person wielding the story. So in the Kazuo Ishiguro reading that we read this week, in The Buried Giant, the book tells the story of the residents of this fictional Britain who are under a spell that makes them forget their past, owing to some terrible trauma that haunts the edges of their story. In the scene we read, the town has taken the candles away from the elderly couple as they are afraid that they will burn down the town by accident. This scene always hurts my heart when I read it. I see the candle, their flaming chalice, as the symbol of their voice and truth. In many ways, the town takes away their opportunity to tell their own story and to discover their own truth. They are left to sit in the dark. Our stories are like lights that illuminate the world around us, tinting it with meaning. And like lights, we are able to share our stories with each other to help and illuminate the world for each other. The couple in Ishiguro's story complain that they have never dropped a candle before, but because of the spell, no one remembers any event for very long, and we are left with the sense that perhaps they did start a fire. Or at least this is the story that the town tells. The sadness of this tale is that they don't live in a world where the answer to the potentially justified fear of fire is to maybe have different members of the community live with them at night to help them illuminate their lives. So often our just impulses find expression in unjust actions. The free and responsible search for meaning means hearing multiple stories and hearing our story in the context of those around us. As an investigator of police misconduct at the CCRB, I was trained at interviewing folks about trauma. Trauma often disrupts our ability to clearly recall the facts or details of a given incident. Part of the trauma is that trauma creates gaps in our memory such that clear recall can be hard. It is like the trauma itself dissolves our stories and leaves them fragmented or disjointed. Because the telling of these stories in the context of the police misconduct, it had to inform a juridical and fact-driven process to adjudicate guilt and innocence. So it was of paramount importance that investigators prompt the richest account while avoiding tainting the memory with suggestive questions or fabricated facts based on anticipated responses. I liken the process to gathering fingerprints. You want the clearest print, but you don't want to smudge your own thumb in it. And the most effective way to do this, we found, is to listen for a very long time and ask sensory questions with the fewest words possible. Simple questions like, what did you smell? What did you see? Tell me more about yellow. This process releases memories that people are not aware that they have. As we would go through this process, people's stories typically started as recitation of the facts, short and to the point. But as they sat in that space and dwelled in their memory, a multicolored tapestry emerged that surprises them most of all. It seems like we can't be reminded enough in this society that silent, active listening is often the best source of support that we can give each other. When was the last time that you sat with somebody who gave you their full attention for an hour or more for you to tell your story? Indeed, when was the last time that we gave ourselves that amount of mental listening? It's a powerful experience to be listened to like that, and many people experience a sense that healing begins on the other side of sharing their story. Having interviewed so many people, I have come to realize what a gift it is when someone shares with you their story in its full detail. If listening to someone tells them that you value their humanity, somebody sharing their story with you says that they feel safe with you and that you're worthy of their collaboration. We live in a media market that has trained us to expect stories to be entertaining, that deploys addictive strategies to ensure we keep watching, or which make us yearn for another life. This media environment privileges certain voices and certain stories over others, often solely with the goal of converting these stories and voices into capital. Listening to each other's stories because we value the centrality of these stories to our very being is a countercultural act. Listening to a multiplicity of stories, voices from below, so to speak, is an act of rebellion against the consumerism that has begun to take over our lives. Listening to another person's stories tells them that they are valuable, that their story is meaningful, that they have a truth to offer. If we think of those whose stories are not shared, we will find those whose power structures are oppressing. If we think of people whose stories we only hear through highly curated means or only through the mechanism of someone else's interpretation, we can locate oppression. Think of the stories that our society tells for other people. The stories of the homeless as helpless or deranged as opposed to the stories of homeless families who are actively working but cannot afford rent. Or the stories of the trans community who our society is just now beginning to learn how to hear. And this takes me back to Terry Best. I hear that he has not been seen for some time, and I will likely never know any part of his story beyond his name, whether that name was chosen, facetious, or his birth name. I imagine what our town would be if we were given the gift of his story from him, if we had provided the space and place for him to tell it. Instead, we're left with the story of a town who could not house every member of it, We are left with legends and tales which express our contradictions more than tell us anything about Terry. Too often our world takes away our candles, and then we all sit in the dark, though some of us pretend that we are in the light. And this works both ways. Listening to others lets them know they are valuable and loved and worthy, and sharing our own stories with ourselves and with others allows us to experience that same affirmation. Our stories are beautiful lights and gifts that we each give each other and ourselves. Our stories reveal truths and weave meanings. Intentionally listening to our stories is vital to our spiritual lives. Actively listening to a multiplicity of stories is itself a social justice action in which we can all engage. Perhaps most importantly, listening to and dwelling in our own stories is vital. Actively listening to our own stories, loving them, and honoring them as gifts we give each other. And I just think that Dostoevsky, the Russian author, wrote it best. He says, "And above all, don't lie. Above all, don't lie to yourself. The person who lies to themselves and listens to their own lie comes to such a pass that they cannot distinguish the truth within them or around them, and so loses all respect for themselves and for others. And having no respect, they cease to love." Telling your story to yourself and gifting it to others requires a fidelity to truth and love, a deepening of our spiritual wells. Our stories at their core are more than entertainment or profit, but the deep sources of our meaning making and truth disclosure. As such, storytelling and listening are all part of our ministry as you use. May we strengthen the bonds of love and truth in the multiplicity of stories we encounter. May it be so, and amen.